Prime Big Deal Days are here with 2 days of big savings exclusively for Prime members. You'll feel like a VIP.
Right this way. Your hairdryer deal is waiting.
Sweet. Deals from clothes to electronics. It's on Prime Big Deal Days, October 11th and 12th.
I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half-century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access.
Sit down with Terence Moore and the conversation just flows like a mighty river. We were lucky to have him join us a couple years ago in the early stages of this project. He shared rich tales from his distinguished career, which began in the late 1970s. And Terence provided great insight into the challenges that he and others faced in breaking down racial barriers in sports media. Well, I'm pleased to say that Terence is joining us again with a new round of stories. He's got a lot of them after 45 years in the business. He's our first repeat guest, and for that, we're very honored. Hey, Terence, great to have you back on Press Box Access. Welcome.
Hey, I remember the last time I was here. It was so great. I know this will be as great, probably greater.
We set a high bar, Terence. We had a lot of fun last time we talked, and it was so much fun a couple years ago going through your career. What a career. I mean, dating back to the late 70s, we had some great stories. And as usual, since we last spoke, you've been keeping very busy down there in Atlanta. Still writing, offering analysis on TV and radio, cranking out books. Last year you had a book on Hank Aaron, the real Hank Aaron, it's called. And now you've got another new book out, Red Brick Magic, about all the great, amazing coaches and managers and sports executives that came out of Miami University. As you like to say, the real Miami in Oxford, Ohio, not the U. So I think it's going to be cool to talk about a lot of characters in those books, because I think what they'll show is, your experiences with them in the last 45 years are just great examples of what it was like to be a sports writer, especially in the days when we have much better access to the subjects. So tell me a little bit about, let's dig into the book about Miami University. I know it was a labor of love for you. Tell us about your proud time at Miami as a graduate, 1978.
Yeah, you know what, Todd? I was destined to write this book for so many reasons. And let's just kind of go backwards in the last, the last 45 years. Of course, I'm a graduate of Miami, Ohio. I went there from 1974 to 1978. And then later after that, I joined the alumni board. So I was a member of the alumni board for 6 years. And then on top of that, I taught there as a visiting professor for 7 years. So I think I'm qualified to talk about Miami, Ohio for a whole lot of reasons. But the other thing is, being a spiritual person, there's no such thing as coincidence. And there's so many moments in my life, even before I went to Miami, and certainly during the time I was at Miami, and definitely the time that I was after being at Miami, that made me the definitive person to write this book about just an incredible story of all these coaches and administrators and just sports personalities in general, come from this little college in southwestern Ohio that hardly anybody knows about, but everybody knows about.
Yeah, let's think of the names here. Paul Brown, Woody Hayes, Bo Schembechler, Ara Parseghian, Weeb Ewbank, John Harbaugh, Sean McVay, his grandfather, John McVay, who built the Niners great teams in the 80s and 90s, Wayne Embry, Walter Alston, on and on. There's so many of them. And again, I think you got to know a lot of these guys during your career, because I think your ties to Miami opened some doors for you, right?
Well, it really did. And you left out a lot of them because there's so many to mention.
Well, let's go back to your days at Miami, and we'll start there, because really it launched your career. So you're a student at Miami University, and you're the sports editor of the student newspaper in 1978. And you're in Indianapolis at Market Square Arena for the first round of the NCAA tournament. It's defending national champion Marquette playing Miami. And you're the student newspaper reporter, and you're there, you're the sports editor. So your first real significant time experience as a sports writer involves Miami. What happened that day?
Well, I'm glad you asked. And I'm getting chills right now. What is it? At the time, I wasn't a math major, but what is that? It's many years later now, and I'm still getting chills over what I'm about to tell you. At the time, my father was AT&T supervisor, so he got transferred around the Midwest, born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, home of the University of Notre Dame. We got transferred to Cincinnati and then to Chicago. But I finished my last couple of years in high school in Milwaukee. So I'm very familiar with Marquette and also very familiar with Hank Raymond's rather. I was also Hank Aaron. That's another story. But Hank Raymond's was the Marquette coach, but taking over for the legendary Al McGuire.
Right.
And it turns out I encountered Hank Raymond's several times in Milwaukee, just walking around. So getting to that particular game, okay, it's March 11th, 1978. The game was at 11:30 in the morning. Can you believe that, Todd? And they put in.
Well, what I can't believe is that sports writers were able to get up that early.
Yeah, right. But I mean, this is it. The NCAA wanted to get that game over with. It was going to be a blowout, and they were looking forward to Marquette playing Kentucky, number one ranked Kentucky, in the second round. You know, and Marquette was ranked number 2 and 3 at the time. About 10 minutes before the game, I'm walking behind the Marquette bench, and Hank Raymond, the Marquette coach, sees me and recognizes me. Says, "Hey, how's it going?" And I told him, I said, I'm a student at Miami of Ohio. And then he just kind of gets this kind of like this sort of like sad look on his face. He taps me on the shoulder and he says, "They've got a nice little team."
Nice. Nice little team. Oh, yeah. I bet that went over well.
That's exactly right. And of course, we know what happened later. Miami upsets them in overtime. And at the time, Sports Illustrated called it the greatest upset in the history of the NCAA tournament because Miami was such an underdog. Jimmy the Greek Snyder was a big odds maker at the time. There were 32 teams in the NCAA tournament back then. He gave odds for every single team of making it, winning the national championship, except for one, Miami of Ohio. That just tells you how big of an upset that was.
What did that day feel like for a young, a kid trying to learn how to become a reporter? What did it feel like to experience that, and how did that affect you as you went forward and became a full-time journalist?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question because, and I must say, Miami, prior to that, kind of prepared me for that moment because of the great success of that football program. Again, 32-1-1, hadn't beaten Florida, Georgia, South Carolina in bowl games, beaten Purdue a couple of times, beaten Indiana, beaten Kentucky. So, I was used to being in these big moments, but you can't get bigger than that. I mean, again, Marquette, the defending national champions, 4 returning starters, Butch Lee was a player of the year, and Little Alabama. I mean, it was
84-81 was the final. And like you said, Butch Lee, Jerome Whitehead, defending national champs.
It was amazing. And, and Todd, one of the things for us being sports journalists, you remember moments, that may not have anything to do with what took place on the court or the field or the diamond. I'm going to tell you one of my most unforgettable moments came from that game. So Miami of Ohio, they win the game. And back in those days, we were right on court side. Right. Now, not so much. But anyway, we're right on court side, and right to the right of me is the Marquette Pep Band. The game ends.
So you got a horn in your ear at all times and a bass drum.
That's exactly right. The game ends, and a young lady in a pep band just stands up and just passes out of the court. And to me, the loss of her Marquette Warriors, they were the Warriors at the time, to Little Miami, Ohio, was just too much for her to take. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And then one other quick story about that is years later, I want to say 15, 20 years later, and this is also in the book, and it was after Al McGuire died, this legendary head coach, and I'm working at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I'm writing a story about Al McGuire. So I said, you know what, let me call Hank Raymond, who was Al's assistant for so many years before he became the head coach, to find out what he thought about Al. So I call up Hank, and we're talking, and then he just stops in mid-sentence. He says, "Yeah, you went to Miami." And he just went on this rant for about 10 minutes about that game and about a particular call he didn't like. And he was saying that I will never forgive the official for making that call. All these decades later, that was still bothering him.
Yeah, they always remember the losses, right? Well, that really, a few months later, you're working at the Cincinnati Enquirer as a young reporter. You get hired right out of school. And, you've got this experience with that great football team that Miami had in the 70s and this big basketball upset. So you go into, journalism, and they immediately just put you right to work. They told you at one point early on, hey, go find Walter Alston. And let me set the stage with this one, because Walter Alston, he was before Tommy Lasorda. Walter Alston, he was the manager of the Dodgers for 23 years, going back to the days of Jackie Robinson. And Walter was in his second year of retirement, and he lived in Dartown, Ohio, which was just outside of Oxford. You're a young reporter, and they say, go find Walter. What happened?
Yeah, here's the other thing, too. Walter Alston, a Miami, Ohio graduate. Another guy that was part of the Cradle coaches. And Walter Alston, his nickname was Smokey, but it could also have been Silent. Just a very withdrawn guy. And it was just so amazing to me how this guy was such an effective manager when he was, he was noted for not really saying much. I mean, just a quiet guy. He wasn't dismissive of the media, but he wasn't exactly giddy. You know what he was? Todd, I just thought about this. This popped in my head. He was the anti-Tommy Lasorda. That's what he was. Okay. Yep. And but anyway, so they tell me, okay, it's my second year at the Cincinnati Enquirer. They said, hey, could you see if you can track down Walter Alston to see if he can talk? Now, even then, as a young reporter, I know Walter Alston's reputation. I'm like, okay, yeah, right. I mean, you're giving it to the young reporter to do this, right?
Oh, yeah. Let's get Terence to do it.
Yeah, get him to do it. Get Mikey to do it. He'll eat anything. Actually, this was my first year. It was my first year at Cincinnati Enquirer. So I, like a dumb, report. I figure how they find out. I just looked in the phone directory. And by goodness, he was listed in the phone directory. And that taught me a lesson that a lot of these guys back then, not so much now, they were listed. So I just called this number, Walter Alston, Dartown. He answers the phone. And so I'm thinking to myself, I need to get this guy immediately. So the thing I thought of doing, and it's a trick that I use for the rest of my life. I said, Mr. Alston, this is Terence Moore, Cincinnati Enquirer. I went to Miami, Ohio. I graduated from Miami, Ohio. That was a trick I learned for the rest of my life.
That was like your pass key. You could get into any door with that.
That was it. And I said that, I want to know if I could talk to you about retirement, blah, blah, blah. And I said, what would be a good time to talk to you? And he said something like, he says that, we can come by after dinner. I'm like, I didn't expect that he was going to invite me over to the house. So he was like, hey, come on over. That, Todd, was one of my all-time favorite interviews. I spent
Why is that, Terence?
Well, for one, he's a hard guy to get, and you don't expect to have Walter Alston to invite you over to his house, okay? That's one. Number two, when I got there, he was so fascinating. There were so many aspects to this man. I mean, he was a guy that he liked to work on. He was like a woodsmith. He liked to work on things with his hands. He liked riding motorcycles. He told me about this. Yes.
I can't picture that. A guy with 4 World Series rings who doesn't like to talk, but he loves momotorcycles.
Exactly. And at this point, he's in his late 60s, One of his biggest vices, though, he was like a chain smoker. He was smoking Lucky Strikes like crazy. But the thing was, he's introducing me to his wife, to his mother-in-law his mother-in-law lived with him, and they were offering me donuts and coffee. And it was just like this family that was just like, you're like a grandparent, at that point for me. And he's showing me his backyard where when the Dodgers used to come to town to play the Cincinnati Reds, he would often have gatherings at his house. Dartown is approximately 37 miles from Cincinnati. So all those guys, Maury Wills, Sandy Koufax, they would just come out to this little country town, to
have a little cookout, right, in the backyard.
Cookout. And his wife and his mother-in-law did all the cooking, and that sort of thing. But that was all great. But the one thing that I would cherish for the rest of my life, it was a Monday. Monday in May or June, something like that. I spent part of that evening in the living room of Walter Alston, sitting in his easy chair, watching Monday Night Baseball. And I'm thinking to myself at the time, how many people get this opportunity? I'm here with this Hall of Fame manager, 23 years with the Dodgers. He managed Jackie Robinson, Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale, and it's just he and I sitting in his living room watching Monday Night Baseball. It was surrealistic.
Was he questioning moves? This is only 2 years after he was in the dugout.
Well, you can tell he was. And it was like, for instance, there were times, it was early on during that session, Todd, when I wanted to ask him a question, and I just looked at his face, and I could tell he was digesting what was going on in the game, like he was out on the field. So I didn't want to disturb the moment. It was still sort of like that.
Right.
But that was one of many fascinating encounters I had with what is called the Cradle of coaches.
Well, let's go to another one. About a year later, you get sent up to Columbus, and I love your curiosity, Terence. That's what's made you such a great reporter and writer. You go up there to interview Tom Cousineau, who was an Ohio State linebacker who had just been selected number 1 overall in the NFL draft for the Buffalo Bills. This is 1979, I believe.
79, yes.
And so it's about 5 months after Woody Hayes had been fired as Ohio State coach. So you go up there to do a story about Cousineau, but you decide to be curious. What happened then?
Yeah, well, I was I was getting ready to drive back to Cincinnati, and and this is the way I thought back then, and actually now, as a matter of fact, it was like, well, since I'm in Columbus, what else can I do? And I started thinking, well, Woody Hayes. I mean, Woody Hayes had punched the Clemson player in the Gator Bowl in 1978.
5 months earlier, right?
5 months earlier, and just disappeared. Nobody heard from Woody Hayes. He would pop up from time to time at different functions around Columbus, but for the most part, he had not talked to any media person whatsoever. And he was an exile. So I thought, well, maybe if I could do a fun column or story or feature story on trying to find Woody Hayes. Not thinking I would find it, just a story about just kind of humorous thing. So I'm asking various people, have you seen him? Have you seen him? And no, of course, nobody has seen Woody Hayes. So I'm on the verge of going back to Cincinnati, and the very last person I talked to before I'm getting ready to go down 71 from Columbus to Cincinnati is this young student, female student, and I said, hey, would you have any idea what Woody Hayes is? She said, she got a pause. She says, I heard he's got an office in the Naval Science Building. And I'm thinking, okay. And I was going to dismiss it, but I said, let me go check it out. Yeah, it could be part of the fun story. So I'm walking up the steps, to like the second or third floor, and I open the door, and I literally run into Woody Hayes, almost knocked the man over. And for anybody who don't know, Woody Hayes had a very volatile personality. Okay?
No, are you serious?
So I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to get punched out here. I'm going to be on the front page of the papers everywhere. And I said, Coach Hayes, I apologize, blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, no, son, I want to apologize for knocking you over. And then he asked my name. And I'm like really nervous. And even though I go by Terence Moore in headlines and what have you, but my people call me Terry Moore. Mm-hmm. So I just said, Terry Moore. So he says, oh, Terry Moore, you're the old center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals. I had no idea what I was talking about. But there was a great center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, Hall of Famer.
Yeah, Woody was a big baseball fan. He knew his baseball. Yeah.
He really did. So we're talking a few minutes about that. So one of the things that I believe in, like I tell my students, I believe in true transparency. So I just said, Coach, I need to be honest with you. I said, I want to know if I could talk to you for 5 minutes, but I need to tell you that I'm the reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. And he got this look on his face. I thought he was going to give me like a right hook or something. And then he said, he looks at his watch. He says, you asked for 5 minutes. I'll give you 5 minutes.
You should have asked for 2 hours, Terence.
That's exactly right. Todd, he gave me exactly 5 minutes. But it was the greatest 5 minutes I could think of. And at the end, I said those magic words again. Hey, I'm from Lima, Ohio, blah, 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 again. And when he heard that, his eyes just lit up. And from that point on, to make a long story short, which is all in the book, we had the most unbelievable relationship after that, as some of the moments will shock you when you read Red Brick Magic.
Well, his eyes lit up because Woody coached Miami in 1950-51, and before he went to Ohio State. So, again, he had that tie and that love for that school down there in southwestern Ohio. And like you said, it led to a working relationship, that paid off for you over the next few years, even to the point where you were able to go to the funeral for Woody Hayes when he died in 1987. Yeah. And not many people were had the access to go to the church and experience that. But you did that and were able to write about it.
Yeah, and it was only maybe, if I were guessing, there could have been more than, maybe a dozen reporters that were allowed there, and they put us up in the balcony. And one of the stories I got in the book, I got many interesting stories about that particular incident. But what was fascinating about that time, at least one of the fascinating things, unbeknownst to me and I think everybody else, one of the persons who was doing the eulogy, he was sitting in the front row, and he just started limping up to the podium to give his remarks. And all of a sudden, it was like we were looking between ourselves. That's Richard Nixon. So it's like the former president then, who was very close to Woody Hayes, had this relationship that went back to the 50s when Richard Nixon was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. They were very, very close. And then just the irony, for those who know Richard Nixon's past and was Woody Hayes, they had a lot in common in many ways. One of the most eloquent things I've ever heard in my life. So there was that. But the one thing I point out in the book is that Woody Hayes did not like microcassette tape recorders. And Todd, you probably, I don't know if you encountered Woody or not, but Woody was, to say old school is to be an understatement. There's a famous story about Woody Hayes in Columbus when a reporter was trying to interview him with a microcassette tape recorder. Woody Hayes knocked it out of the guy's hands and stuck his finger in his chest and said, "Take notes like a man." So there's that story. So
I don't know what Woody would have thought about podcasting.
Yeah, right. But I'm using that to set up this story. So the one stipulation they gave us, the few media people who were at this funeral in Upper Arlington, Ohio, which is outside of Columbus, they told us that we could not bring in any electronic devices. Well, God forgive me, I snuck in a microcassette tape recorder. I mean, I just had to. There's no doubt about it. So I snuck it in and took the head recording. And so when the thing is over, I listened to that thing, oh my goodness, maybe hundreds of times. It was so great. The Nixon speech and everything. Had all right there.
Wait a minute. You have the Nixon tapes.
The Nixon tape, yeah. One shot.
Just like Watergate.
I love about that war in Vietnam. But anyway, so I had the tapes. I listened. So then it was like 5 or 6 months after that, at the funeral, I'm thinking to myself, I got to preserve these tapes because these are so valuable. So I put them somewhere, and you know the rest of the story. I have no idea where that tape. I've done searches. I mean, I can't find it. And so the only way I can think, what I think about, which I put in the book, this was Woody Hayes' revenge. It was like I said, young man, you broke the rules.
Nixon knew a thing about tapes disappearing. There's an 18-minute gap in Terence Moore's tape from Woody Hayes' funeral. Well, Woody, there's so many stories about Woody, and 28 seasons at Ohio State. He's obviously the iconic legend of college football in the state of Ohio. But you also got to know another person whose name, I believe, doesn't get nearly enough attention anymore because he dates back too far, but that's Paul Brown.
Oh, yeah.
Paul Brown basically built the modern NFL with invention.
He did.
Co-founded the Cleveland Browns, co-founded the Cincinnati Bengals, on and on and on. And you don't hear his name mentioned a lot. Paul Brown, of course, had ties to Miami.
Yep.
So did Terence Moore. And so when you were working at the Cincinnati Enquirer, that once again paid off when you went to training camp for the Bengals, where he was at that point general manager. He had retired from coaching.
And for people who don't know, those early Bengals were outstanding. They were the best expansion team of all time. Within 3 years, they were the fastest team ever to go to a playoff.
Once again, the genius of Paul Brown. I mean, Paul Brown did that with the Bengals. He had won all those championships, 7 different league titles with the Cleveland Browns. Oh. He won a national championship as coach at Ohio State. He was a high school legend at Massillon, Ohio. So again, he did it at every level. And by the time you meet him, he's an absolute total legend.
Yeah. And the one thing that and I'm going to see the story about it, is that the one thing that Paul Brown does not get enough credit for, if not any credit for, that needs to be talked about more. Everybody talks about April 15th, 1947. That's when some guy named Jackie Robinson wrote the color barrier in baseball. And to many people's thinking, the color barrier in sports. Wrong. That would be Paul Brown. Paul Brown, a year before that with the Cleveland Browns, I became the first coach to play African-American player. Not one, but two.
Two, right? Marion Motley and yeah.
That's exactly right. That's a year before Jackie Robinson. So anyway, that Paul Brown, okay, 1979, grew up as a diehard Bengals fan, and this is at this point my second year at Cincinnati Enquirer. So I'm sitting up to Wilmington, Ohio, and that's where the Bengals used to train back in those days, hot day and just steamy. And this is all part of the story, Todd. This was back in the days when if you were in training camp, you could do anything shy of take a chainsaw to somebody's legs. Okay, I'm talking about tour days, 3-hour practices, not manicured lawns, just hot sunny day. Anyway.
Yeah, there was no load management at the NFL training camp in those days.
Yeah, none of that. So I'm just this kid, first NFL training. I'm scared to death. Okay, and it's my Bengals. And I'm looking across the field. I see Paul Brown across the way. The great Paul Brown. Not only is he great because of all the things that we talked about, but he's also the guy that went to my alma mater, Miami, Ohio. Everybody knows about Paul Brown. So the practice ends. First of the tour days, Paul Brown is actually the second of the tour days. Paul Brown is walking toward me. And I'm thinking, no, this is not happening. So I'm looking behind me like he's surely looking at somebody behind me. He's walking straight toward me. So he comes to me and he says, "Are you the young man that wrote the story today?" And what he's referring to is I had written this first-person story, George Plimpton style, when I went to Richmond, Indiana to try out for the Reds. And I may modestly say that I did make the cut. I was pretty good back in the day.
Well, some play and some write about those who do play.
That is exactly right. And it was a front page story for the Cincinnati Enquirer. And Paul Brown apparently had read this. And I said, yes, I am. He says, I need to see you in my office. And there's some other things in between there. But I'm scared to death. What in the world? And Todd, you know how this is. When somebody says something like that to you as a reporter, people say your life flashes before your eyes. Well, what you do is everything you've written about that individual flashes before your eyes.
Right.
So I'm thinking, I've never written about Paul Brown. What is this? And I'm thinking about, did I write something bad about the Bengals? I had no idea. That's what I'm thinking, Mm-hmm. So later on, I get to his office, very Spartan office, which is so Paul Brown. And for those who are Bengals fans now, I know some of you can attest to this about the Mike Brown, who's Paul Brown's son, has got the reputation of not being the biggest spender, except for Joe Burrow. But anyway, this was typical Paul Brown, just a very simple office. It was Wilmington College, a dorm, one of these dormitories, no frills, dormitory type deals. So Paul Brown comes in, he sits behind the desk, and I'm sitting in front of him in like one of these little third grader chairs. And we just had a little chit chat. So finally it gets to the point. And by the way, I should say, you don't really chit chat with Paul Brown. He wasn't that type of guy.
You do a lot of listening.
Yes. He also believed in getting straight to the point. So he said, listen, I saw what you did with the Bengals, with the Reds. He said, I want you to try out as a defensive back for the Bengals and write about it. Now, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. That's why I stood up when I told you before. This was the real National Football League. It's not the training camps they have right now, where you don't touch anybody. Whereas it's flag football. No, this was different. And they would have loved nothing better than to have a reporter out there so they could,
you would have been a pinata.
Yeah, right. So I just said, thanks a lot, Mr. Brown or Coach Brown, or whatever I said at the time. I said, but I have to politely refuse. He stood up, he looked at me, and he had the coldest eyes, and he said, think about it. as he walked out.
You did develop a good rapport with Paul Brown. You were able to visit him some other times down at his office at Riverfront Stadium. You mentioned his office at training camp of Spartan. What was his office at Riverfront Stadium like?
Wow. You know, this is one of my favorite parts of the book, is that Paul Brown only really had two visible vices, if you want to call them vices, or maybe that's not the right word, two visible things where he splurged. Let us put it that way. You went into his office at Riverfront Stadium. And Riverfront Stadium, you know, as a young kid growing up, being a diehard Bengals fan, also a diehard Big Red Machine fan, I must add. Riverfront Stadium was built in 1970. And, you know, back then you just think, whoa, a state of the art, whatever. The place was awful. I mean, it was not the best. And not just because they had artificial.
It was like a giant concrete ashtray. All those stadiums in the 70s, right?
It really
multi-purpose,
right?
Cement.
The only thing that I would say that was always a plus, I was always amazed, Todd, you can attest to this, it was always spick and span. And then that's one thing about Cincinnati. All of his sports arenas have always been that way. And I mean, even right now, they're the cleanest facilities I've ever seen. So it was always that. But I'm setting it up to say, to get to Paul Brown's office, you had to know where you're going because Riverfront Stadium was built in the midst of like parking garages, right? And it was just like a hidden door, like find a secret door and everything. And once you got in there, you go into his office. I mean, he had this one window that theoretically overlooked Riverfront Stadium, but it was like the worst view that you could see because he didn't care. I mean, he only cared about the bottom line, and he did the bottom line very well with the X's and O's. But the one thing that was so striking when you walked in there, he had this huge rug of a I can't imagine why, of a Bengal tiger. And and the rug had an actual Bengal tiger head on it.
Oh, come on.
It was. I mean, and it was like one of these things that was scaring the hell out of you. And everybody would just talk about it. It's like, and to this day, I've asked around people like, what happened to Paul Brown's rug? Nobody can tell me. I suspect Mike Brown's got it somewhere, but I would assume. But it was just, I mean, it was just so striking. And the only other thing that he had that he splurged on that was so obvious, he had this love for this Cadillac. Okay, he loved this. He had this old Cadillac that he just revered.
Did you ever get to ride in it?
I did. I wish I could have.
Okay,
but,
all right.
I mean, it was just like, what was that song? Pete Cadillac. I mean, whatever it is. I got almost the song's in my head. But anyway, but those little moments like that, I got them throughout the book about, this tells you about different aspects of the personalities of these guys that perhaps you may not be aware of, or you just be shocked if you knew.
And when you think about Paul Brown, you know, he had all that success as a coach. Then as a general manager, he led the Bengals to 2 Super Bowls, the final one prior to his death in 1991, a few years before that. He lost those Super Bowls to the San Francisco 49ers. And the intrigue of that is the 49ers coach was Bill Walsh, who used to be an assistant coach for Paul Brown with Cincinnati in the early 70s. And then, obviously, the man we mentioned, John McVay. McVay was the general manager of those 49ers. McVay had played for Paul Brown. Think about that. And McVay was from Northeast Ohio, where the 49ers owner, Eddie DeBartolo, was from. So you have all this intrigue of this Ohio subplots going on between those Bengals and 49ers teams back in the 80s. And as you pointed out, the Niners' success was really, Walsh gets a lot of the credit,
right,
and rightfully so as a coach, but John McVay was in the background building that thing. Tell us a little more about John McVay.
I'm biased on this because I'm was a huge John McVay fan. Unfortunately, John McVay passed away last year. But John McVay, I contend that John McVay is the most underrated, greatest figure in the history of the National Football League. And I mean that sincerely. He does not get enough credit. And part of the reason he doesn't get enough credit, the fault goes to John McVay.
Why do you say that? Why is that?
Because not only was he everything I just said, Todd, he was also I got to think about this before I say it. I think I can rightfully say he was either 1A or 1B, the most modest, greatest sports figure I ever met. A lot of times you hear this about people say, well, they don't want the credit. They want others to get the credit. They want to deflect the credit. They wanted to whatever. And a lot of that, as you know, Todd, is media talk. Or deep down inside is like, hey, give me the credit. Look at me, look at me, look at me. John McVay sincerely did not want the credit. He wanted everything deflected from him to Bill Walsh, who gladly would take the credit because Bill Walsh was an egomaniac, okay? To Eddie DeBartolo, who was also an egomaniac. So in many ways, as a matter of fact, Bill Walsh writes about this in his book, The Winning Edge. Bill Walsh admits in his book that the only way that dynasty could have lasted was because of John McVay, because John McVay was willing to sacrifice his ego for everybody else.
Wow, yeah. You don't have that much anymore in sports.
Right. But he was the man. And the way you knew he was a man, again, that 49ers dynasty, which to me is the greatest dynasty of all time, and the NFL. And people say, well, what about the Cowboys? What about the Green Bay Packers? What about the Patriots? Well, here's why it's the greatest. It lasted for 20 years, okay? And again, not buried the lead. This is John McVay with his fingerprints all the way through it. It lasted for 20 years. During that 20-year stretch, that was during a stretch when the National Football League switched systems from going from pre-free agency and salary cap to free agency and salary cap. I miss that because the Niners won 2 of their Super Bowls in the old system. They won 3 of their Super Bowls, their 5 Super Bowls, in the new system. Okay? Who was there? John McVay.
Yeah, he was the common denominator, right?
Right. 20 years. They have Joe Montana as a Hall of Fame quarterback. Who's responsible for him? John McVay. Okay? People say, well, Bill Walsh, yeah, but I'm telling you, not to get into the details, John McVay had a lot to do with Joe Montana. John McVay had a lot to do with Steve Young, coming from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to the 49ers.
Now, hold on a second, Terence. Why do you say that? Not to get into details, but why do you think McVay, as much as anyone, had such an impact on 2 of the greatest quarterbacks ever, Montana and Young?
John McVay was a very astute football mind. He was a scout. He knew talent. I mean, he was very good at talent. And Bill Walsh told me that many times before that he had never met anybody who knew talent more than John McVay. John McVay, I'm going to exaggerate the point to make a point. He was very much like Paul Brown. Paul Brown was like this too. They could watch a guy for 10 minutes and know everything they need to know about him. Whether or not they could play or whatever, and then project to how that person is going to fit into their system, not only in the coming weeks and months and years, but down the road. John McVay was constantly a multidimensional thinker. He was all of that. So he was able to see what a Steve Young could do and project at the same time. Now, remember they got Steve Young when they still had Joe Montana.
Right.
And he's projecting, okay, well, at some point, Joe Montana, blah, 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 Steve Young, and it worked, okay? So he was a constant denominator through all of those different changes. So for 20 years, he is a guy that was always there, okay, no matter what. Steve, all right, and think about it. 3 different head coaches. Bill Walsh, Hall of Famer. George Seifert, may not be a Hall of Famer, but certainly a perennial Coach of the Year guy. Steve Mariucci takes it to the playoff. 3 different, but the same general manager. So that's why I say that he was such an underrated guy and the key to that entire run.
Do you have a personal memory of an experience with McVay yourself, you and him, that you treasure to this day?
Yeah, there's so many, but if I had to pick one, and this ties very deeply to the Miami thing. This is in 2010. It was right before the Super Bowl, which was out in San Francisco at the time. And I got a chance to huddle with John McVay out there, just talking about the Super Bowl coming up and his young grandson, some guy named Sean McVay, you may have heard of him. And we're talking about all these things.
Who, by the way, also beat the Cincinnati Bengals in the Super Bowl.
Exactly.
I don't think Mike Brown and the Brown family want to hear any more about the McVays.
No, not at all. And he's sitting there, and then he just starts talking about emotionally, and this is all in the book, about his time at Miami. And he's reminiscing about all these guys, Carmen Koza, who went on to be a great coach at Yale and the winningest coach in the history of the Ivy League when he retired. Bo Schembechler, Ara Parseghian. Oh, how I loved Ara Parseghian, John McVay. And he's just getting misty-eyed and teary-eyed. And he gave me this great line. He says, we were just having so much fun. He said, we never wanted to leave. He said, but we had to leave. But we didn't want to leave. And I was just, I love that because I can relate to that. And I loved it in the sense, here's this man, this grown man, 50, 60 years later, and he still has this great emotion for his alma mater. That has worked to my favor through the years. Because I go back again, I can't tell you that Miami connection has opened so many doors for me because of that emotional feeling people have toward Miami.
You mentioned Ara Parseghian, and McVay played at Miami with Ara, right? I believe they're on the same team.
Yes. Yeah.
And Ara had played for Paul Brown.
Right.
Think about this. I mean, again, all the ties there. And then Ara goes on to become this great coach. He coached Miami, and then as an assistant, and then he for Woody Hayes, and then he became Northwestern's coach, and then he went on to legendary status at Notre Dame. 1964 to 1974, won 2 national championships, one of the all-time coaching legends at Notre Dame. Also, you were growing up in South Bend at that time, right? So you have much more than just a tie with Parseghian with Miami. Okay, so then you become an adult and a journalist, and you cross paths professionally with this guy that you grew up with at a distance, kind of, worshiping as the guy. But then starting in the late 70s and moving forward through your career at Cincinnati and San Francisco and Atlanta, you developed a rapport with this guy. Tell us a little bit about how your relationship developed over the years, your professional relationship with Ara, and how that paid off in terms of journalism.
The first time I met Ara was at a Notre Dame Navy game, 1979. This is the first time I ever covered a Notre Dame game in South Bend. Again, he was
working television at the time.
Yeah. And right. And I went up to him. I told him I grew up in South Bend. This is Terry Moore, and he could tell I was nervous, but he just he made me feel at ease right off the bat. And then I said the magic word again. I graduated from Miami, Ohio. Oh my goodness, I had him right there. And it just went from there, where whenever I was in South Bend, or many times I was in South Bend, I would huddle with him over something. Times he would come to Miami, and I was there. He was at Miami quite a bit, because he was also on the board of trustees at Miami University.
Right.
And we developed basically a friendship, a very, very strong friendship, to the point, which is in the book, Ara told me things that he had never told anybody before. And among the biggies, it's in the book, is why he really retired at that young age, as you say, of 51. And the story is fascinating. It's kind of a 2-part story there. And some of the other interesting things he told me about his stay at Notre Dame.
Okay, well, let's hear why Ara retired, because, again, it was shocking. At age 51, he was at the top of his game. Notre Dame was national champions. Why would Ara want to walk away from that at age 51?
It was a 2-part thing here, and you can read the details in the book, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Note version. The first part of it is, you have to understand, in 1973, he won the second of his 2 national championships, won the other one in 1966, and actually should have won 4, but that's another story. So 1973, okay, they win the national championship. At the end of that season, a handful of his defensive players, might have been some offensive players in there, but I'll just say a handful of his players, 5 or 6 of his players, were accused of rape, sexual assault, something along those lines. And it got some publicity, pretty significant. Because anything that time that Notre Dame does anything that's considered bad, people want to jump on Notre Dame. It's really holier than thou. So Father Hesburgh, the legendary Father Hesburgh, who I knew very well, he was the president at the time, basically called Ara into his office, and Father Joyce was another legendary priest at the time, and just said that we want you to make the announcement to the public that these players will be suspended for the 1974 season. Okay, now, two things here. Ara didn't think that the players got a fair shake because there was some extenuating circumstances involved that Ara told me about, which I don't share in the book, by the way. And then the other thing was Ara didn't feel that it was his place to make this announcement. I mean, as much as he revered Father Hesburgh and Father Joyce, he thought that was more of an administrative type of thing, but Ara did it anyway. And as I point out in the book, after Ara made the announcement that these players, pretty prominent players, I mean, were suspended for the 74 season, he told me that after the press conference at Notre Dame, he drove home and got in his driveway, and he was so emotionally exhausted, he almost could not get out of the car. And that's when he started thinking to himself, this is beginning to be too much. He also had these physical elements, but that was part one. Part two, which I point out in the book, the season takes place, 1974. And everybody thinks that what pushed Ara over the edge was the last game of that regular season. 1974, they won the national championship in 73. Notre Dame still has a chance to win back-to-back national championships. They're playing Southern Cal at the end of the season. And at right before halftime, Notre Dame takes a 24-0 lead. And then some guy named Anthony Davis returns the opening kickoff right before intermission, and it's 24-7. But you know what? We got this. Except final score, Notre Dame 24, Southern Cal 55.
55. Oh, 55 in a row by the Trojans.
Exactly. The worst beating in the history of Notre Dame football, period. And there's some stories behind that. I'm saving that for another book. Anyway, so the off-season takes place. We get to near the end of the season. Ara announces his retirement. So everybody says, aha, the reason Ara is retiring is because of 55-24 Southern Cal, Turbo. No, they would be wrong.
Because he told you much later when you were a columnist in Atlanta, because of this relationship you had developed with him, he confided in you much later the real reasons why he retired. So give us that.
Yes. And Todd, I can see why you have such a great podcast because you are so good at setting up your guests. I love that. Okay, I'll give me a high five. Yes. And he told me, he said, it wasn't that game. He said it was a game earlier in the year when, wait for it, Notre Dame was playing Navy. Yes, Navy. We're talking about the same Navy that Notre Dame had beaten every year since 1963 when a guy named Roger Staubach beat them. Since that point, up to that point, Notre Dame had not only beaten Navy every year, but crushed them, okay? So this particular Navy game took place in Philadelphia. And it was a particularly grueling game for Notre Dame, even though they won the game, okay? But it wasn't by Notre Dame standards or Ara standards.
It wasn't enough for the Notre Dame fans.
Yes, and it wasn't enough for Ara, okay? So Ara says the game is over, and he was just totally exhausted there in Philadelphia. And he said that he became even more exhausted when he was walking back to the team bus. And he says he gets on the bus. Okay, this is a Navy outside of the old stadium they played there. It might have been Veterans Stadium.
Franklin Field, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, probably Franklin Field. And he said that he gets on the bus, and he says out of nowhere, he says a couple of students, I don't know if they were Notre Dame students or Navy students, jump on the bus, and they're all liquored up. And he says one of them comes over and just kisses him, gives him a kiss right on the lips. So he said they're flying back to South Bend. He's thinking about the kiss. He's thinking about the Navy game. He's thinking about the suspended players. And think about how remarkable this is. In spite of those suspended players, I mean, they were still having this great season. You think about all that. And then he said he got home, he opened the door to his house, and he said that his wife was, in the hallway. He said he had his bags. He just slung his bags on the floor of the hallway, and he just saw his wife with slumped shoulders I'm out of here.
Mm.
That's when he first said, I'm gone. And never changed his mind from that moment on. Didn't tell anybody. He kept it to himself until near the end of the season when he told Father Hesburgh and Father Joyce. And here's the rest of the story. This is also good, too. They were going to make it very dramatic. Like the Gipper. Notre Dame dramatic, that sort of thing. So what they originally wanted to do, he told Father Joyce and Father Hesburgh near the end of that season, even before the Southern Cal game, that he was going to retire at the end of the season. They were going to save it to right before the bowl game. Okay?
Right.
They didn't know at the time they were going to play Alabama, but think of how dramatic that would have been, Todd. If like right before the bowl game, Ara announced, I'm out of here, they would have done something like upset Alabama, which they ended up doing anyway. But anyway, but the story leaked because his replacement was a guy named Dan Devine. And Dan Devine had been the first choice for Notre Dame before Ara Parseghian back in '64, if you believe that or not, okay? And Dan Devine at this time was the coach of the Green Bay Packers. So Notre Dame always wanting to be ahead of the curve, even now when it comes to coaching hires. Notre Dame had already talked to Dan Devine and told him, hey, look, Ara's going to retire at the end of the season. Would you want to be the coach? Dan Devine is still with the Packers, and he agreed. So it was all set, and they wanted not to tell anybody, wanted everybody to stay quiet till at the end of the season, except Dan Devine ran his mouth off to a columnist, can you believe that, a columnist in Minneapolis. And there's a great, you probably know that, there's
Sid Hartman.
Sid Hartman, the great Sid Hartman.
Right.
Sid Hartman being like, how we can be, Todd, we can't hold a secret. Spilled the beans, and it was out there.
So that changed Notre Dame history right there.
That exactly did.
Well, I think the fact that Ara Parseghian trusted you enough years later, after getting to know you, to tell you some of the details he never really had shared before about his retirement, which was so shocking in 1974, the end of that year. I think that just shows you the trust and the relationship that you were able to develop with so many of these big-name coaches and athletes because of dating back to those ties at Miami. And I think that comes across in your book, Red Brick Magic, and I recommend that people check it out. It's really a great read because there's so many great stories about famous names who all have this thing in common. And Terence Moore is the guy to write it because he has it in common with them. And you did that throughout your career, great career. I also recommend The Real Hank Aaron, an intimate look at the life and legacy of the home run king. In our previous episode, which you should check out, Terence had some great stories about Hank Aaron. And I've really enjoyed just catching up with you again, Terence. Wish you the best of luck with your future books. I know you're never going to be done. You're still writing. And thank you so much for joining us again on Press Box Access.
Yeah, I'm going to leave with a quick tease tip for you, Todd. I am in the process of writing book number 3.
Oh, okay.
And it's going to be a...
breaking news here.
That's right. You're the first to hear this. It's going to be a head turner. I can't give you any more than that, but I'll be on your podcast to talk about that one too.
Well, I'll be glad to have you again, Terence. You're always welcomed in our tavern.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer, Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Have you ever wanted to know how to win a Formula One Grand Prix? I mean, really know about the driver tactics from the cockpit the strategy calls from the pit wall, and even the mind games in the paddock. There's a lot more that goes into winning a Grand Prix than just 90 minutes of racing. So every week on the F1 Strategy Report, we're taking a deep dive into the decisions that shape every result. Hey there, my name is Michael Laminato, and every week I'm joined by an expert guest from the paddock to talk through the big calls that won the race and the missteps that resulted in bitter defeat. Before every race, we'll look back at the previous year's result and consult the current form guide, and we'll be in your feed after every Grand Prix dissecting the outcome and what it means for the championship. So for your regular hit of Formula One analysis, subscribe to the F1 Strategy Report wherever you get your favourite podcasts. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast on the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name's Michael Laminato, and I'll catch you after the checkered flag.